This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and it's Saturday, and that means it's time for Nizzanotes, this weekly vlog video I do where I talk about limited magic. And today we're continuing by talking about some more Innistrad Midnight Hunt. We're getting pretty deep in the format at this point. We probably don't actually have that many more weeks of me talking about it here, but we're doing it some more today. And in this video, I want to talk about 10 cards that people need to stop playing in Innistrad Midnight Hunt Limited because they're bad. They're actually 10 cards I think you should never play, but they're cards I've seen people playing. So, I'm giving this advice based on seeing people playing these cards for one reason or another. And never is a strong word. There are cards in this format that maybe aren't great, but I could see you playing them in certain situations. These 10 cards, it's not really true. I don't think you should ever play them. So I'm going to talk about these 10 cards. And hopefully if you are playing them, I'll convince you and you'll stop playing them and you'll see your win percentage go up. I want to start with the biggest offender of all of these up front, and that is Stuffed Bear. I can't really understand why people are playing this card. I guess people see this as sort of like a 2-mana 4/4 or something, but that's just not what it is. Even to activate it the first time, you're paying 4 mana for a 4/4, and then over the course of the rest of the game, it's basically, like if you want to look at it as a creature you have in play, it's a creature that can't attack or block or do anything else unless you pay 2 mana first. And that's not a good deal. You're spending a ton of mana just to have this thing be a creature, and it's not worth it. People, I guess, the idea that this is a big creature for what seems like a little bit of mana is cool, but it's not. Just don't spend the mana on this. Just run a 2-mana 2/2, and you'll find that it's way better than this thing. Another one is Pithing Needle. I think this is a card that people run because it's a rare, and they assume it must be good. And indeed, it is incredibly good in constructed formats. It's one of the most common sideboard cards ever in formats it's legal in, because it can shut down entire cards and shut down entire decks. But in Limited, you just don't encounter that. There aren't decks completely built around one activated ability very often. If this was a format, if this were like War of the Spark, Pithing Needle would be kind of interesting because everyone has Planeswalkers and you could turn off their activated abilities. But I guess most of the Planeswalkers in War of the Spark also have static abilities, so it wouldn't even be that good there. But it takes constructed basically for this to be good. You're not going to know what to name with it. Even if you do have something to name with it, when you play it, like you see a creature with an activated ability, you're not really taking away a full card from your opponent. You're taking away like a quarter or maybe half a card if you're lucky. So you're basically mulliganing by playing this card, so stop doing it. Next up, I have 2 green cards that are pretty good sideboard cards if you're playing best of 3, so disregard this if that's what you play. These are pretty decent to bring in out of your sideboard. But if you're playing best of 1, you should not be playing Plummet or Return to Nature in your main deck. There just aren't enough targets for them. And I know, yeah, you see flyers a lot, but guess what? The flyers that you see, a lot of them are creatures with Disturb, and blowing up 1/2 of one of those cards, not really worth it most games. And that's usually what you're going to be doing. There just aren't enough targets for Plummet to really be something you can say, yeah, I'm going to main deck that. And the same is true of Return to Nature. There aren't enough artifacts and enchantments in this format, and just being able to snipe a card in a graveyard isn't good enough about 90% of the time. There are times where it can feel pretty good against the right cards in graveyards, but most of the time it's sort of like Plummet. You're taking away half a card for a whole card, and that's rarely worth it. Next up, I've got Curse of Shaken Faith. This is another card that I think because it has a cool type like Curse and because it's a rare, people are playing, but they shouldn't be. This is sort of like a Lava Axe type effect. All it can do is damage the opponent, and cards like that, usually not great in Limited if they don't actually add to the board, and this really doesn't. And this is even worse than something like Lava Axe in most cases, because Lava Axe always does 5. If you play Curse of Shaken Faith on your opponent, you may impact their game minimally, but you're really not going too much. There will be turns where they're like, okay, I can just, play spells a little differently and not take damage. And there will be turns where they're like at 20 and they don't care if they take damage. So it just doesn't damage them often enough. And, that's even true with the black-red deck in this format, loving it when people hurt themselves. It's not good. You're just not going to do enough damage with this for it to be worth the 2 mana you spend on it. You might do 4 over the course of a game or something like that, and that is definitely not worth it 99.9% of the time. don't play Curse of Shaken Faith. There's another rare curse I want to talk about. That's Curse of Silence. This is a lot like Pithing Needle. You don't know what to name most of the time, first of all. Second of all, it doesn't even make it so your opponent has that much of a barrier to playing the card. If you name the right card, they have to pay 2 more to cast it and you get to draw a card. That definitely matters. Like, if you could always play this and always name a card your opponent wanted to play, it would be a pretty good card because it would tax them and replace itself. I mean, maybe pretty good's a strong word, but it would sort of feel like a decent card, like a solid card in your deck that replaces itself. But the problem is, you don't know what they're going to play. And sure, you can name a card with Disturb or Flashback, as I see people say. But once again, you're not really taking care of an entire card when you do that. And you're using a whole card to do it. This one does ultimately replace itself, but you still have to end up in the right ideal situation where things line up so that you can actually name something that's already in your opponent's graveyard. And there'll be plenty of situations where you have no idea what to name and this card does stone nothing. And even when it does do a thing, it's not that exciting. Next one I want to look at is Kathars Call. I'm not a big fan of auras in general in Limited, especially if they don't replace themselves somehow or give a big stats boost. And this really doesn't do either of those things. Yes, if you stick this on a creature and it stays in play for a few turns, you're going to get your value back because you're going to get those 1/1 tokens. The problem is, whatever you stick this on doesn't get much of a boost up front. It gets Vigilance. That's not really a boost that matters a whole lot. Second of all, you're paying 3 whole mana for it. And that is a huge liability for an effect that takes this long to get going because all you're doing is setting yourself up for a very easy 2-for-1. This is even worse in this format than it would be in most. In some formats, I'd be like, yeah, if you want to go wide, you can make this work. But this format, especially blue, has so much bounce that this card gets even worse. And basically all the colors have really good efficient removal that will just blow you out when you play this card most of the time. It's just not going to stick around and do what you want it to. You also need to have a creature in play in the first place, and you're going to want it to be a pretty big one so it's not easy for your opponent to not only 2-for-1 you, but do it for 1 mana. So yeah, don't play this card. It's not worth the risk. The upside's just not there. Another white card I want to look at is Sunset Revelry. This is another card that's just way too situational and you shouldn't be playing it. It's easy to imagine pulling off all 3, and if you do that for 2 mana, it's great. Even if you can just get the tokens and draw a card or gain the life, it's an okay card. But there are so many times where you get none of these, or you get one of the modes that doesn't really feel worth 2 mana, like gaining 4 life. Just not going to be worth it. And you have some control maybe over creating a board state where this does a thing, especially if you have sacrifice outlets and stuff, but it's so much effort for what is this is nice upside when you really get it going, but it's not game breaking. And the downside here is too much to overcome a card that's just the max upside is just that's that's some nice efficiency. That's not enough max upside for a card that does stone nothing way too often. So stop playing Sunset Revelry. Let's close things out here with a couple of black cards. First up, there's Duress that I want to look at. This is a card we see all the time. It's a good discard spell in Constructed because people run more instants and sorceries. In Limited, this card's not very good. You're not going to have things to hit with it a lot of the time. It gets a little better out of your sideboard, against an opponent who clearly has a ton of non-creature spells. But it's still not very good. You're not going to hit things with it most of the time. And some of the stuff you'll hit with it has flashback and stuff like that. So it's not going to feel worth it. The other one is Necro Synthesis. This one is maybe the most controversial one on the list. This is the one I've seen people play the most, and I just can't understand why they're doing it. It's sort of like Kathars Call. I don't think it's actually quite as bad. It helps that it costs less mana, and it helps that it also replaces itself. So whatever you put it on gets killed, you do get to get a card back. And getting that thing back is nice. But for, I like these kinds of auras normally that mitigate against a 2-for-1, right? Normally those are the kind of auras I can get behind. But this one, not so much. Mostly because the boost it gives just, it just doesn't do enough most of the time. It's way too slow. Even if you're in the sacrifice deck, it's going to take a while. And if you're not getting much of a boost out of it, and all it is a 2-mana aura that replaces itself, that's not really worth it. Yes, you avoid getting 2-for-1, but you give up significant tempo, and you're playing a card that's just not worth a card. Effectively it becomes a blank card with cycling. And yes, it has some upside, so it's not quite blank, but For the most part, it's just not going to boost your creature enough, and it's just not going to be worth a card in your deck. Just playing a 2-mana 2/2 is better than playing Necrosynthesis. Yeah, so those are my picks for 10 cards that people are playing in Midnight Hunt Limited that I think they shouldn't be playing in Midnight Hunt Limited. And if you stop playing them, I think you'll see your win percentage go up. All right, so as usual, we'll close this out with a crack-a-pack where I, look at a pack one, pick one scenario of Midnight Hunt and go through all the cards and tell you which one I would first pick. So let's do that now. All right, so here's our pack. Let's start with the commons. First one is Tavern Ruffian. 4-mana 2/5 on the front, flips into a 6/5. It's all right if you're playing in a red deck. It's definitely not great. It's not. This is a card that I think has really underperformed overall. I thought like the idea that it has an upside of being a 4-mana 6/5 would be awesome, but it just turns out it's not that great in this format. It won't be that 6/5 very often. And removal's good enough in this format that a creature like this that doesn't have some sort of value it brings with it and costs this much mana is a little bit of a liability. Candle Trap, another card that's really underperformed. It's not bad by any means. I would definitely take it over Tavern Ruffian. The bummer about the card is that it's not that great if you're aggressive because you put it on your opponent's thing and it can still block, and that is a huge downside if you're the beatdown. If you're a more defensive deck, it does get a little better because it can buy you time. But one of the big downsides is if you don't get Coven going, and you're usually not going to have it in the early game, Coven and the mana available to do this just aren't going to line up that much. And so sometimes you won't ever find time to exile the thing. Once you do that, it feels pretty good. And sometimes you can do all of it for 4 mana. And when Candle Trap does that, it's pretty good. But it's definitely short of premium removal. Letting your opponent still have a static ability, letting your opponent still have a creature that can block, letting your opponent still be able to sacrifice the creature in a format that has a bunch of ways to get value out of it. All of that makes this card worse than it would be in most formats. Next up, we've got Celestis Sanctifier. Another pretty mediocre common. Candle Trap, definitely the pick so far. This has okay stats. It loads your graveyard a little bit. And the blue-white, Disturb deck, it's an okay card to have around, don't get me wrong. I mean, it can help you load your graveyard, it helps you basically surveil when it becomes day or night, but that doesn't happen a ton. You're mostly playing a creature with subpar stats with a pretty minimal effect. Certainly a card you'll play, but certainly not an especially good one. Candle Trap still my pick here. Mounted Dread Knight, this thing's okay at the top of your curve, especially if you're in black-red. It's a nice thing to have on top, but it'll often come down as a 6/5 trampler. It has kind of the same problem as Tavern Ruffian, though, in that there's so much efficient removal and bounce and stuff in this format that a creature that just is a creature is a little bit worse than it normally would be. I still like this card more than the Ruffian, just because it is a very real threat in the late game. Trample makes a world of difference, but I would still take Candle Trap out of these 4 commons we've looked at so far. That's going to change here, though, because we've got Gavany Silversmith, one of White's better commons. It comes down, immediately adds 2/2 worth of stats to the board, and that's the kind of thing that makes it better than something like the Ruffian. It's going to give you value no matter what. It's going to put counters somewhere. Your opponent can't really just kill one thing and be free of the threat. They're going to have to deal with the value the Silversmith gives you almost no matter what. It's also quite good because it can help you get Coven out of nowhere because it adds itself to the board and then can put a counter on 2 things, and that can suddenly give you Coven and trigger a Coven trigger that's really good. It's a really high quality white common, and it's what I would take so far out of this pack. Gavany Silversmith, great in the blue-white, great in red-white. It's good in all the white decks, basically. It's been a pretty impressive common overall. Morcrut Behemoth. So, if you have a bunch of zombie tokens, this isn't the worst payoff for it. That's kind of the idea here, or other sort of expendable bodies, tokens and stuff in general, like if you're in black-white, that's an okay thing to do. But as we continue to talk about how good the removal is in this format, a card like this gets worse in a format where that's true, just because you're paying a pretty big setup cost, and if your opponent kills it, it's a big bummer. That said, it's a fine card to include, especially if you're short on payoffs for all of your zombie tokens in a black-blue deck. It's a fine thing to have. It can definitely close out games. I definitely think Gavany Silversmith is better, and probably Candle Trap too. Next up, it's Flip the Switch. This card's been a pretty nice one. Any of these cards that just tacks on a zombie token has just really overperformed. And this tends to counter stuff for a lot of the game and give you a zombie token. You always have to be worried about this card against a blue deck that's leaving 3 mana up on turn 3, and it makes a big difference. It adds to the board even while countering a thing, and granted, what you add to the board is like the worst token ever, but it's still adding to the board while having a very real 1-for-1 effect, and I like that a fair bit. I would still take Gavany Silversmith over it, though. It's not the kind of like, blue-black card that you're like, yeah, I'm snatching this up and I'm going to see if blue-black's open. It's not that powerful. It's sort of a nice card for the deck, not a key card for it. Next up, we've got Unblinking Observer. This thing's fine. It ramps for you for spells and for things you cast from your graveyard, which includes Disturb, which includes Flashback. And it's at its best really in blue-green, where you're like trying to cast your Rise of the Ants out of your graveyard and stuff. But it's just a decent card. Gavany Silversmith still my pick in this pack so far as we move through the commons. Howl of the Hunt, not a great card. One you mostly don't play. If your deck's short on removal, or if you're like, normally in green-white you want tricks and you're hoping you get the better tricks than this, but this can fill the role if you really need it to. It's nice that it's a stats boost that sticks around, unlike most tricks, but it is a little costly, and the untap effect on it is mostly not important. So it's definitely not a great card. I'd probably take literally every card we've seen in this pack so far before it, even like Celestis Sanctifier. So it's not great, not entirely unplayable either. Crossroads Candle Guide, this thing's all right. If you're desperate for a creature and or fixing, it can do it. You mostly don't play this card unless you're really desperate, which means it's not very good. And yeah, it's probably the worst card we've seen so far. I would play Howl of the Hunt over it. Definitely still on Gavany Silversmith. Now we move into the uncommons. We've got Obsessive Astronomer. This guy's solid. I mean, he has decent stats, and then throughout the game, he can help you dig through your deck effectively to find whatever it is you're looking for. And I've been reasonably impressed with that overall. Don't think it's quite as good as Gavany Silversmith, though. The Silversmith just has such a big impact on the game for a common, and it does it immediately, and the Astronomer just doesn't do it. Ritual of Hope. This is a pretty nice card if you're trying to go wide, and green-white especially, because if you get Coven, it gives a huge boost. It becomes Inspired Charge for half the mana, which is quite impressive. But it does require a fairly specific deck to really succeed, and that's one that's good at going wide and good at getting Coven. Generally, that means green-white. Whereas the Silversmith is good in a broader variety of decks. You'll play it in every white deck, almost entirely in any white deck. Ritual of Hope requires a little more work to really be worth playing, and I think I'd still take Gavany Silversmith. All right, next up we have Flame Channeler. This is an interesting card. So it's another 2-mana 2/2 in red, and it can transform when you do damage with a spell into a 3/3 who gives you the ability to get some extra cards every time you do damage with a spell. So your typical red deck in this format probably going to have like 1 to 3 ways to do damage, and that makes this a very playable card. I mean, it has a very good baseline anyway as a 2-mana 2/2. You're definitely going to end up in some red decks where you have like 1 or 2, and in those cases, it's still a reasonable playable because it can be a 3/3 eventually, but in those cases, it's not great because you're just never going to generate any value off of the backside. But sometimes, I mean, especially in black-red is actually where I've had the most damaging spells. I grab the vampire 1 damage, deal 1 damage to a creature, deal 1 damage to an opponent, draw a card thing. You get that card. I've had 3 or 4 copies of that and been running Flame Channeler and that kind of deck, and it's been really good. But it takes a specific enough kind of deck, and your chances of ending up in that deck aren't super high, that I think I'm still on Gavany Silversmith here. I think it's better than these 3 uncommons. Maybe not in a vacuum, but in your typical deck you're going to end up with in Limited, Gavany Silversmith is the best card in this pack so far. Our rare is Can't Stay Away. This is an interesting card. It can reanimate a small creature, and then it has flashbacks. So you end up with 2 things over the course of the game. It's pretty good. Most decks are going to have enough smaller creatures that this does something. The thing I don't love about it is you generally, in the very early game, you're not going to be able to do something with it. Sometimes you'll trade a small thing and then just bring it back, and that's a fine play, but it's not that great. And then you can reanimate something else later. That's where the real value comes from with this card, is being able to reanimate 2 things with it. Even though you spend 7 total mana, you are getting a 2-for-1. And so Can't Stay Away does generate some serious value in longer games. But the fact that it's a multicolored card, I think, and not an incredible one. I mean, you'll play this in literally every black-white deck you end up in, but your chances of ending up in black-white are much lower than they are that you're just going to end up playing white, right? So I think if we look at the probability of what you're going to end up with, most likely, you kind of have to take the Silversmith. It's maybe not the exciting pick. I mean, you have some exciting cards here, especially the Channeler and Can't Stay Away, but they're both cards that require you to basically, they're cards where you have a lower probability of getting maximum value out of them. For Can't Stay Away, it's because you might not end up in black-white, and for Flame Channeler, it's because you might not end up with enough damaging spells. Whereas Gavony Silversmith is going to very consistently be good. It has a much higher floor than either of those cards, even if it does have a lower ceiling. And I think that makes me comfortable with taking the Silversmith here over the uncommon and the rare, both of which are cool cards or fun cards. But I think if we're trying to win, we probably take Gavony Silversmith here. All right, so that does it for this edition of Nizzanotes. If you want to know more about my thoughts about this limited format, I've done a set review, multiple other videos on it, including more episodes of this series, Nizzanotes. You should see some playlists shortly. If you want to catch more of this series, more of me talking about limited, we're actually not that far from the Crimson Vow limited set review, believe it or not. If you want to stay aware of that stuff, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to support what I do, you can do that on Patreon. Thanks for watching.